Good. Well, it is 10:01, so I think we will go ahead and get started. So thank you all for tuning in again. This is week 4. So we did a little theological introduction. Our first week, Angela brought us through wonderful Bach cantata, and then last week, Lauren Gamble did some wonderful deep dive into the Annunciation and this that one, because of some sort of copyright stuff, the presentation from last week, if you didn't have a chance to look at it, we are going to post it, but we're going to post it privately, so you'll need to email the office or Lauren, Anna Stewart, to get the password to be able to see it. But we will be able to see it if you guys want to check that out again, or if you missed it from yesterday. And so today we are thrilled to welcome Steve Severn, professor of English at NTSU, to walk us through another form of art, and that is poetry. So Steve, thank you for joining us for this and for the work that you've done, and we're looking forward to diving into a little bit of T.S. Eliot with you. So take it away.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I went ahead and posted a copy of the poem in the chat, yes, along with a link to it. It's long enough that it had to go into 2 separate postings, but it's over there, and I'll go through it. Poem's called Journey of the Magi. Obviously, we tend to think of the Magi and associate with Epiphany, but I think this is actually an Advent poem. I will say this is a start. If I had to pick only like 10 poems, if I was going to be stuck on a desert island for the rest of my life with only 10 poems, this would definitely be one of them.
Can you repost it? I'm not seeing it, and maybe because I joined after you.
Okay, I can do that. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Give me 1 second.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's A-okay. Okay. There we go. Before we dive into the poem itself, I want to say a couple words about Eliot, the poet. A couple words about this is an example of modernist poetry, and it's important to know a little bit about that. And then also the form of the poetry. It's called a dramatic monologue, and if you don't understand what's going on with that, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense to you. So Eliot is one of us. He's an Anglican, Church of England, born in St. Louis in the 1870s, goes to Harvard, is kind of a phenom, makes his way over to Britain in around the 1910s, and becomes tied up with and connected to a group of very sort of influential and sort of avant-garde poets and musicians and writers, people like Virginia Woolf, the Bloomsbury, people like that. As a poet, Eliot really, really, really advocated against the idea that the poem should reflect the poet. He was a big believer in what he called impersonal poetry, so you shouldn't write poems. You shouldn't write oh, I'm sad, therefore I'm going to write a poem. You should write poems that are based upon thought and intellect. That was his approach to poetry. Having said that, he does wind up in a mental institution in the wake of World War I, around 1920. And this is one of the first poems he writes when he comes out of that. And I think it's kind of hard not to sort of trace his own experiences there kind of lurking in the poem. This is a modernist poem. Modernism is a movement that starts taking shape in the late 1800s and really kicks off in the wake of World War I. World War I, as I'm sure you all know, created death and devastation in ways that simply never been seen before. And with technologies that were new, things like airplanes and tanks and chemical warfare. And it left a really deep mark, particularly on Europe and on art in general. So people like Picasso and Cubism and really fractured and disjointed art became kind of the norm, and that is sort of the mark of a modernist poem. And this is very much a modernist poem. last thing I'll say about it is that it's what's called a dramatic monologue. So a dramatic monologue is just that. It's one person speaking. And when I teach this in class, I always say the way to imagine is imagine you're standing on a street corner and you're hearing one side of a conversation. Someone going like, yeah, uh-huh, okay. Oh, so she had the baby. And how big? 8 pounds, 9 ounces. Wow. Okay, we'll buy pink then. We need pink cigars. Got it. Bye. If you heard that, you would know that someone had given birth to an 8-pound, 9-ounce baby girl, right? You got to have the same approach as we go through this. And the way the poem is set up is that imagine this is one of the magi, that travels and goes to see the birth of Christ, speaking, years later, years after the fact, when they've gone back home to their own, where they came from, and their own lands, and they're recounting their experiences with the birth. And the reason it's really, I think, an Advent poem is we think of the Magi and, the 3 wise men, and we see them appearing at the nativity scene. That's the traditional, way we think about it. But this is about the journey. It's about how they got there. And that to me is really what Advent's all about. So that's some context. I'll read it to you all, and then we can talk a little bit about it and see what you all think. So here we go. Journey to the Magi by T.S. Eliot. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camelmen cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands and an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again. But set down this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. So I'll point out a couple things I think are sort of central to how you want to react to the poem. One thing that strikes me every time I read this is that after this long journey he describes and the travails they have, he describes the place as satisfactory, which is to say, fine, it was okay. The other thing I think, and it's how you want to read it, and I think it's sort of key to how you react to the poem, is the last line. I should be glad of another death. There's 2 real ways one can look at that. You could say that I should be glad of another death, presumably his death, isn't to say I should be looking forward to the death and the resurrection that comes with it. But if you say you should be, that implies he's not. The other way is to look at it as like, I should be glad to go with you to church on Sunday, which is to say they are looking forward to it. It depends upon how it is you choose to sort of approach that. I really like this poem. I think because to me it points to the idea that faith is a really hard thing, and that when one decides to find a new life and a new birth in Christ, that there's a price that comes with that. And I think it's easy to overlook that, and that, the Magi goes back home and finds himself, as they says, no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. He's gone back home to the people he knows, his family, his friends, and they are still very much operating in a pre-birth of Christ mentality. They are still, clutching at their gods, but now they're an alien people. They are literally not like him. That's a hard price to pay. And he asked the question, were we led there for birth or death? And I think that's ultimately one of the things that the poem is really getting at, is that this duality of this, that with rebirth, when you bring something in rebirth, you have to let something go as well. So that's, and I think that is sort of, as we look ahead to the birth of Christ, and that's what Advent is about, that we need to have those ideas, I think, in our heads. It's a complicated thing. One of the things Eliot's doing here is taking an image which is usually pretty happy and exciting, the manger scene, and the wise men come tramping in, they got their gold, incense, and myrrh, and it seems just awesome. But I think Eliot's forcing us to say it's more complicated than that. And it because it's more complicated than that, it deserves greater attention than we tend to give it. So that's one of the reasons thematically why I love this poem. So I'll stop talking now. Eliot's most famous poem is probably The Wasteland, which is an incredibly long, very complex poem that he writes, in the wake of World War I. And its opening line is, "April is the cruelest month." And it's sort of getting at what I think both David and Margaret are saying, is we think of April as a time of rebirth and renewal, but that comes, that transformation is not an easy thing, right? And it's hard, and it carries a price with it, and you may not recognize it right away. I think your point, Margaret, is very good there.
I think the others, I don't have it.
The three trees on the low sky is obviously a harbinger of the three crosses, right? On a crucifixion. Now, one of the hallmarks of a modernist poem is they like to use allusions, not with an I, with an A. So they like to make reference cryptically. And this goes back to Eliot's idea about poetry of the intellect, right? He's going to use symbols and references that, if you're careful and you pay attention, like, oh, wait a minute, dicing for silver, that is, although this is a story about the birth of Christ, looking about that's an allusion to and calling to mind, the dicing for silver we associate with the crucifixion and things like that. And Eliot's interested very much in, again, this intellectual poetry, and so he wants to create poetry that you're not going to necessarily respond to just as, oh, it's a love poem, I know what it's like to be in love, this makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. He wants to create a poem that seems a little bit like, if you don't know, if I take the title off this and just hand you this poem, you're gonna have no idea what it's about. Like, what are we talking about, right? Cold coming out, what is it? And even with it, you have to figure out that it's a monologue, and you have to read through to the end to figure out that, when he talks about this, it says all this was long ago. You have to read through the end to realize the actual context, and he's forcing you as the reader, and this is what he wants, to make sure that you dive into it headlong. And I'm about to lose power here. Hold on 1 second. He talks at one point, Swinburne says, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean," and the idea that the coming of Christ upsets the mythology and the religions of all that has gone before it. Other folks have thoughts, responses?
Steve, I was also struck by the finding the place it was, you might say, satisfactory and this at the end of this long journey, it's satisfactory, and that pinged a couple of things for me. One is Hamilton, the song "Satisfied," right? Angelica sings, and there's an interesting sort of interesting thoughts about that. But more, for me, how many of our encounters in worship or encounters with Christ are satisfactory? Like, that happened, and yet somehow, as Margaret was saying, transformative. And yeah, I don't know, just sort of wrestling with that. What happens in transformation? And it's these moments of not necessarily the moments of great joy and the mountaintop, but it's the slog, it's the satisfactory. That affects transformation when we pay attention to it. And then the other piece of that is satisfactory, I think, is tied into this idea of being satisfied, being nourished, being full, having what we need. I don't know, but that beautiful, and it was glorious. It was incredible. It was the best thing ever. It was satisfactory.
And that refers to the place itself, though, too, right? And I think that's one of the things Eliot is interested in is sort of de-romanticizing a lot of stuff. I think he would say gets in the way of kind of a true faith, and this, I think to him it's not about the manger, or the whatever it is. It was fine. The place was fine. But clearly what happened was transformative, right? And that's where your attention should be. Like, let's not spend a lot of time worrying about, the traditional sort of manger scene with the babe in swaddling clothing. It was just fine. Like, it was fine. Because that's not really the important thing, I think, to Eliot. I think it's the actual experience itself. And he's, too, coming from summer palaces on slopes and silken girls bringing sherbet. That's what he knows, right? So comparatively, it's fine, He's been staying at like the Ritz, and now he's at the Motel 6. So it's fine.
What about the old white horse galloping?
Oh, the white horse.
What's that about?
The white horse of the apocalypse.
Oh.
Yeah, that's one I forgot. Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
In the tavern with the wine leaves over the lintel, is that the Passover?
That could be.
Or the Last Supper?
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about that, but I'll buy that.
I'll take that too. I never thought of that.
Well, it could be the Garden of Gethsemane because it's named for the wine press that was in the garden.
Oh.
But Eliot is well aware of all these things. I mean, he doesn't put those words in there accidentally.
Yeah, he spent a lot of time studying Fraser's The Golden Bow, which is a study of ancient fertility myths and rituals and things, and that's a lot what the Wasteland's based on, as well as a lot of Indian, capital I, spirituality. So he pulls from all kinds of different things, and you're never quite sure. But that's part of his challenge of reading Eliot. At some level, would be what he means is known probably only to Eliot himself. He's no longer here to tell us. So his whole approach to poetry is that whereas Wordsworth claimed poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, which is to say, you go out and look at the sunset and like, wow, the sunset's awesome, I must write poetry. Eliot says, no, you detach yourself, you think about it, you have a cool, calm, collected approach to writing, and everything is done with thought. And you as the poet in Eliot's mind, you disconnect yourself from the poem. And the actual idea of a monologue literally forces that to happen, because there's always a tendency when we read a poem to suppose it's the poet speaking somehow, right? We were trained naturally to do that, unfortunately. But with a monologue, it's quite literally, obviously, someone else speaking. And the very act of creating that kind of poem is a different process and necessarily more intellectually engaged than just writing down your feelings as they come spilling out of you.
I think it's interesting in the poem, there's no revelation of expectation. And what was he expecting? Why was he doing this? And with that left unsaid, I guess it opens the door to all kinds of results, so that he doesn't have to explain, well, my expectation was realized, or no, it wasn't realized. And I thought I was finding this, but instead I found that. So that there can be lots of layers here. And I think journeys are like that. So many people are aware they're on a journey, but they have no idea what it is or what they're looking for or what they're expecting, have hope. And I don't see too many hope here either. So I find that personal dimension interesting. The fact that it's a vacuum means that we can put our own selves into that space and read the poem in terms of our own journey, I think, which is really creative.
The one thing Eliot does give us with that is it's clear, though, that although we don't know why he went, it's clear that it comes that, he says he regretted leaving at one point, right? And the voices are in their head saying this is folly. So clearly, it was not something to be taken lightly. But what drove him, we don't know.
It reminds me of Mary Oliver's poem, The Journey, where she leaves home, even though everybody is begging her to stay and to heal them. But she knows she's got to go, and she leaves. It's the same sense of people clinging to you and things, maybe we clinging to them when we actually have to cut loose and say, I'm going now.
I'm struck, David, also, unless I'm missing it, there's no star.
There's no star.
Poem. There's a hint of we preferred to travel all night, but there's no sense of them following a star, which is such the sentimental part of our imagination of this.
One of the things that modernism as a movement is interested in, and one of the things it really explored was, particularly in the wake of World War I, in which there was the sort of just devastation in ways that had never happened before, there was a decided loss of faith in the traditional artistic structures. That's why realist painting goes away. That's why you get like atonal music. That's why you get like Virginia Woolf writing narrative fiction that doesn't have traditional narrators, right? And there's a sense that somehow the ways we used to tell stories are not only kind of out of date now, they're somehow led us down a wrong path. And so I think what Eliot's trying to do is deliberately strip away all the stuff that we normally associate with the Magi and their story and say, that's really not that important. What's important are these spiritual questions, and we need to focus our attention here. And we get so fixed on the gold, incense, and myrrh when we don't think about the human condition. And I think so at a level, I think all that stuff is missing because Eliot's saying it's not that important, and that by focusing on it, we've actually missed what really is important. And we three kings of Orient are bearing gifts. He should say we three kings of Orient are struggling with our faith, right? I mean, I think that's what he would say the song should probably, how the song should probably go.
That's such a fascinating word for us in 2020, when so much of the familiar has been stripped away, even and especially in Advent and Christmas.
I think in Eliot's mind, every reader should know everything Eliot knows, and that therefore they should put as much time and effort into working through his poetry as he put into writing it. So that would necessarily be a part of it, as would digging through every obscure allusion and thinking about rhythm and imagery and all those kind of things, right? I mean, I think, and you know, I think that one of the reasons that modernism as a movement embraces that is they feel like art in its broadest sense should be hard, right? Because that's how art pushes you to grow and develop and transform. You know, if you look at a realist landscape painting painted, you know, around 1850 in Britain, you can look at it like, oh, you can talk about the technique, but you look at it, you see it, it's there, you got it, you can kind of move on. Whereas you look at something like a Cubist perspective, you got to sit there and stare at it and think about it, and you got to ponder what's going on, figure out where you are in relation to it, and it forces you to engage at a different level. And I think the modernists would tell you that's the way it should be, that art shouldn't be easy. If art is really designed to reflect the human condition and transform things, that should come with some degree of struggle. Really good question, and the idea of, you know, this poems writing corresponds to his own Eliot's transformation, Anglicanism. You know, and like I said at the beginning, Eliot will tell you that, you know, the poet must be completely disconnected from his poetry. Impersonal poetry is, you know, that the poem should not reflect the poet. And yet and I will say, one of the things I really struggle with my own students is you always want to resist assuming that the speaker in the poem is the poet, because poems are not necessarily imaginative creations, and there's always some distance between the poet and the speaker of any given poem. That's generally really true with Eliot. It's especially true with Eliot. Yet it is hard not to read this poem and look at this as about faith and things like that, and not understand it, at least to some degree, as a product of his own religious transformation. I think we'd be foolish to sort of not see it that way to some degree. But as to what level it is, that's really impossible to say. But again, you know, I mean, the speaker of the poem was literally not Eliot. And yet the fact that he would choose to pursue this idea at that time, I think it just doesn't make any sense to me. There's not some connection there. Top of my head, no. I mean, you look at something like Proof Rock, I mean, that's really about his, you know, sort of his own kind of, at some level, again, he would say it's not about him, but it seems about, to the extent that Eliot appears in his own poetry, it seems about his own just sort of coming to grips with his own coming to middle age. And The Wasteland is about World War I in the broadest sense, but there's a great line there, these fragments I have shorn against my ruins, which I've always read as a reflection of his own sort of commentary on his own mental state. But this is certainly one of his most overtly religious poems. I'd have to go dig out my complete T.S. Eliot and go. His later work is just not as good, and I haven't dug through it in a long time. After this, he gives us, you know, 4 quartets. He gives us the Hollow Man. He does Cats. You know, Eliot is ultimately responsible for the Broadway play Cats, as strange as that may seem. So, but his later work is just not. It gets increasingly less accessible, and it's not as interesting to my mind. So I'm not as versed in that as I probably should be. My own specialty is narrative fiction. I'm not really as much of a poetry guy, so although I certainly have taught Eliot and feel comfortable speaking about his earlier stuff. His later stuff is a little more down the path for me. But this is certainly the most of his famous poems. This is the one that is most overtly engaged with questions of sort of religious. Although The Wasteland does make all kinds of references to Middle Eastern and Far Eastern religions and things like that. But in terms of just a direct sort of lift, it would be this one. He immediately follows it up, but set down this, which gives you the sense it's almost like the Magi is telling his story to someone that's, you know, transcribing it right. And he wants to make sure you get, like, this is the detail we have to have. This, and because he repeats it, right? He repeats it and you get the broken line. Set down this, set down this. And then the question, were we led all that way for birth or death? Like that they want that part of it. I would do it again, but whatever else happens, don't forget this aspect. This is the key aspect. Notice too that they capitalize his birth. There was a birth, certainly. A birth, capital B. Again, different than when he talks about birth and death later. And I think he's alluding to the idea of the birth, right?
And that just ties in with our conversation last week and the Annunciation and birth, death, both same, different, yeah. And then of course the art that we looked at, drawing the. Yeah.
If you look at the Advent calendar for today, Viola's calendar,
Mm.
they use the Botticelli Annunciation painting that Lauren talked about last week. I thought that was interesting.
Go, Lauren.
Steve, this has just been, it's been wonderful. Thank you. And Margaret,
Thank you.